Hi, welcome to Here and Now. I'm Steve James. This is our initial episode in our series on violence in America. We have for you an excerpt from a presentation made by Dr. James Giligan at Left Forum at Pace University in New York in June 2013. James Giligan is an American psychiatrist and author who is best known for his series of books on the causes and prevention of violence, which he based on 45 years of research in prisons and jails with the most violent men our society produces. For 35 of those years, he was on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School. He is currently a clinical professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine and adjunct professor in the School of Law at New York University. He's the author of a number of books, including Violence, Our Deadly Epidemic and Its Causes, and Preventing Violence. Here is Dr. Giligan at Pace University.
Well, thank you. I want to talk about violence as a human propensity that threatens the survival of all of us unless we can get a better understanding of what causes it and how we can prevent it. And I'm concerned with, personal and interpersonal violence, but also with collective and political and military violence. To me, violence runs across all these categories. I've used, for the last 45 years, I've used prisons and jails in this country and many other countries as you might call social psychological laboratories in which to engage in research on the causes and prevention of violence. I've written several books on the subject, and I'm going to summarize some of what I've concluded from these decades of working with the most violent men that our society produces. And I emphasize men because that's mostly whom I've worked with, partly because violence is overwhelmingly a male problem. I mean, the overwhelming majority of violence is committed by males. Suicide, homicide, warfare, capital punishment, torture, you name it. I mean, any form of violence is overwhelmingly most often committed by men. So female violence is very important, and I don't mean to slight it, but we have a limited amount of time, and I really want to focus on what I think most threatens our survival as a species. Now, a couple of comments that Ernest Becker made that I just want to mention at the very beginning because they do relate my own work to his. One was his insight that the fear of death is a major motivator of human behavior. I would simply qualify that by saying that what I learned from working with as I said, the most violent people our society produces, is that their primary fear was not death of their body, it was death of the self, or as I've come to call it. Now, what I mean by that is these guys, there were murderers, sometimes mass murderers or multiple murderers and serial rapists and so on, would tell me that before they started committing their crimes, they themselves died, even before they killed somebody else. What they meant by that was they felt dead inside. They felt numb, lifeless. They didn't have feelings, either emotional feelings or even physical feelings. They would mutilate themselves as viciously as they had mutilated their victims. Not because they felt guilty, it wasn't an act of penance. They were notable for their lack of guilt feelings. But because they found this sense of numbness and deadness more tormenting than even physical pain would be. They just wanted to see if they could feel alive by feeling pain, and then were often amazed to discover they didn't even feel pain. I mean, they could do things, I don't even want to turn your stomachs by describing what they would do to themselves, but I think they couldn't have done that if they had feelings of pain. They just felt numb and dead. Now, what was it that killed them? Overwhelmingly, when I would review their life histories, it was experiences of repeated and overwhelming humiliation, they could often describe the moment at which they felt they became dead. It was when they had just felt totally rejected or described as worthless or like a piece of shit or like dirt being walked on and so on. But our language tells us this. I'm a great believer in etymology as a source of understanding about our collective psychology. one of the words for overwhelming humiliation is mortification. We speak of somebody being mortified.
That's right.
It comes from Latin words meaning to make dead. I mean, it's right there. And what I also discovered from these people was their violence was their way of trying to undo or prevent the death of the self. If they could make somebody else feel humiliated by punishing them and making them afraid and so forth, they could then feel powerful and like agents of their own fate. Again, our language tells us something about that. When people suffer an indignity, it causes indignation. And indignation is what leads people to kill other people or want to inflict pain on them. When I would ask violent men why they had assaulted or even killed somebody, they would tell me over and over again, different people completely independently of each other, that it was because this person disrespected them. And or disrespected their wife or their girlfriend or their mother or their brother or whatever. And they use that term so often they abbreviated it into the slang term, he dissed me. And it struck me that anytime people use a word so often that they abbreviate it, it tells you something about how central it is in their emotional and moral vocabulary. When I at first thought I had discovered something original, when I started noticing this, and I began to think the ultimate, I'd say necessary, although not sufficient cause of violence is feelings of being overwhelmingly shamed and humiliated. I started reviewing the literature and discovered, my God, this has been noticed by everybody who has studied violence. You go back to the first recorded murder in Western history, the story of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
I'd never understood why Cain killed Abel. I couldn't find any meaningful motivation for it until I actually started working with real murderers. And then I realized, no, the Bible said it very clearly, thousands of years before I did. Cain killed Abel because God had respect unto Abel and unto his offering, but unto Cain God had not respect. I'm quoting the King James translation. In other words, God dissed Cain, or he was dissed because of Abel, and he responded exactly the way the murderers I worked with in the prisons did. This goes throughout history. Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Hegel, any number of people have said this. The modern behavioral sciences, every branch of the behavioral sciences, has come up with evidence that it's feeling insulted or rejected or ridiculed or any number of synonyms for being shamed and humiliated and treated as of less worth than other people, treated as inferior or insignificant, that is how you elicit violent impulses. When experimental psychologists are trying to elicit violence in a laboratory, they insult the people. That's the one foolproof way of getting people to start having violent impulses and to inflict violence on others. It's not just frustration alone, it's feeling insulted. Now, the second thing that Ernest Becker said that I thought was really profound, and it clearly is part of what I'm saying too. He said the modern human sciences have discovered a principle that is about human behavior that is just as fundamental as the law of gravity was in Newton's physics, or the law of natural selection was in Darwin's theories of evolution, and that is what he called the law of self-esteem regulation, meaning that the most powerful motivator of people's behavior is the need to maintain their self-esteem, their feeling of self-worth. When I talk about shame and humiliation, I'm talking about low self-esteem, feelings of low self-worth, and the wish to replace that with its opposite, feelings of pride, feelings of self-esteem and self-worth, and so on. Now, I mentioned that the people I talked with in the prison, the most violent among them, were the ones who told me something I had never read before. Nobody had ever taught me this. I was surprised to hear it. They would say their goal was to go to their own death in a hail of gunfire, go down in a blaze of glory, as long as they could kill as many other people first, and then until they got killed by the police. And this sounds insane, of course, but what I discovered is this wasn't just words. I would see them behave in that way in the prison until they practically begged officers to kill them. Fortunately, that usually did not happen. But on the street, it happens several hundred times a year. The U.S. Public Health Service records every death that occurs by cause, and there's one category to which they've given the quaint label, legal intervention. You know what that means? It means the police shooting somebody on the street because the guy often has forced them. You know, he's shooting people, and they finally shoot him to stop him from killing other people. But, you know, as you know, from just reading the newspaper, in many of the mass murders that we've had in this country over the last 20 years, many of those mass murderers kill themselves after they kill the other person. And it's not their own physical death that they fear. It's the idea that their self is going to be seen as weak, helpless, inadequate, childlike, vulnerable, and so on. They want to act like Superman. One thing that's amazing about death rates in America is that rates of both suicide and homicide go up and down together. I've charted them from 1900, when we first started, our government first started keeping an annual record of deaths by cause. They just literally track each other. They parallel each other. We always have more suicides than homicides, but they parallel each other. So, which suggests the possibility that what is causing the increase or decrease in the one may be having the same effect on the other. The idea that these categories of behavior are related, though also I can think back to my childhood when we would read about kamikaze pilots in the Japanese Air Force who would they would be kind of an early version of what we now call suicide bombers, you know, crashing their planes into an American aircraft carrier. Today, you can't read the newspaper a single day without reading about people who are killing themselves in the process of killing other people, but knowingly, deliberately, intentionally killing themselves in order to kill as many other people as possible, the suicide bombers. So I've discovered that if we want to understand suicide or homicide, we have to understand both. We have to think they really have a lot in common. In the year 2000, the World Health Organization published a summary of violent deaths around the world. And one thing they discovered was that on a worldwide basis, as of the year 2000, suicides and homicides collectively, among all the nations of the world, actually killed about 50% more people than were killed in all the wars going on the planet. So I know that we mostly look at the newspaper to read about deaths from wars, and they are horrendous. But what we overlook is that on a day-by-day basis, people are killing other people, and it's often one by one. Friends killing friends, husbands killing wives, and so on. And this happens on every country on Earth, and actually it's killing more people than the wars. Now, in the US, during most years, suicides and homicides, plus reckless behaviors like drunk driving and speeding and so forth, actually cause more years of life loss before the age of 65 or 70, in other words, before the end of the natural life cycle, than cancer and heart disease combined. I mean, we usually think of cancer and heart disease as the main causes of death. They're actually not. If you think about it, not in terms of what was the diagnosis at the time of death, because cancer and heart disease kill people mostly toward the end of the lifespan. Suicide and homicide kill much younger people. They are, you know, in theory at least, preventable. Another reason why they're so important.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Here and Now is produced by the Humanist Society of Metropolitan New York, the Corliss Lamont chapter of the American Humanist Association. Please visit our website.
We've been listening to a presentation by James Giligan at Left Forum in June of 2013 on some of the causes of violence in America. James Giligan, PhD, is a clinical professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine and adjunct professor in the School of Law at New York University. Here's a continuation of Dr. Gilligan's presentation.
One other factor that I think is important here is the concept of structural violence. This is a term that was coined by some social sciences to, I would say, to prove that Gandhi was right when he said the deadliest form of violence is poverty. What structural violence means is the increased death rate among the poor in societies where the social structure divides the population into rich and poor. And the higher the degree of inequality, the higher the discrepancy between the two. And but I just, well, people have studied this on a worldwide basis. Poverty kills more people than all the wars put together. It would take literally a nuclear war to kill as many people as are dying from poverty on a worldwide basis. Now, but I would want to emphasize that structural violence, which really means the deaths caused by economic inequality and relative poverty. Structural violence is not only the deadliest form of violence, kills more people than all the behavioral violence, but it's also the main cause of the behavioral violence. The main thing that causes people to become violent is on an epidemiological scale, in terms of death rates in a whole population, is economic stress. And I'm going to try to illustrate that in what I'll be saying. But if you go into the prisons, where we concentrate the murderers and rapists and so on, they are overwhelmingly poor, unemployed, uneducated, often homeless, members of demographic groups that are subject to systematic humiliation, often by social and economic means. For example, the unemployment rate among African Americans is always twice as high as it is among whites. Blacks are the first to be fired and the last to be hired. I mean, as the old saying goes. You can relate the death rates from violence, I think, very much to political and economic factors. Now, I say that as if it were self-evident, but let me tell you, I spent 20 years at least looking at the death rates from violence in America since 1900, noticing a pattern and being unable to explain it till I finally realized it can only be explained in terms of the politics and economics of violence. What I mean is this. Since 1900, we've had yearly records of who dies and from what. During that time, the rates of violence, of suicide and homicide, as I said, they go up and down together, have shown, if you chart these on a graph, it looks like the silhouette of mountain peaks and valleys, and mountain peaks and valleys, and mountain peaks and valleys. And what I realized they are showing is epidemics of violence, which then get resolved. And I couldn't explain what was causing the epidemics or what was causing them to, the rates to come down again. Nor had anybody else who had studied this or noticed this. Finally, one day I had my Archimedes moment and said, Eureka. And I thought, this corresponds almost perfectly to the presidential election cycle. And I thought, my first thought was, that's crazy. It can't be that simple. You know, I mean, this just sounds bizarre. In fact, it's not that simple, but it is related. I mean, there is, you know, we all know that correlations alone don't prove causation. So the question is, these are kind of meaningless statistics unless you can find a causal mechanism that would explain the correlation. I mean, I thought at first it was like, you know, there's one commonly cited thing in every Statistics 101 class that when the National Football League wins the Super Bowl, the stock market goes up, and when the American League wins it, the stock market goes down. And clearly this is, you know, nonsense. So you can't assume that a correlation alone proves there's a causal relationship. But what I did discover when I started doing research on this was that in fact there are three highly related, I mean interrelated variables or phenomena that have been identified that have been shown to predict rates of suicide and or homicide independently of political party, and these are unemployment, inequality, and recessions or depressions. In other words, the duration, well, the rate of unemployment and the duration of unemployment both predict violent death rates. The frequency, the depth, and duration of recessions, and finally, the degree of social and economic inequality, particularly in income and in wealth, between the rich and the poor. Now, clearly, these are all related to each other. I mean, unemployment goes up when you have a recession, and inequality goes up when unemployment goes up. I mean, all of these things have been studied. These are not independent variables. But what I thought was interesting was all three of them show the same correlation. They all seem to function as what I would call socioeconomic causal mechanisms explaining the correlation between political party and violent death rates. One way to summarize this is to say that what I described as epidemics of lethal violence have occurred only after Republicans have been elected to the White House. And the decline from an epidemic peak down to a valley has occurred only after Democrats have been elected to the White House. I mean, so there are no exceptions to these generalizations. That doesn't mean that every Republican administration caused an epidemic. Eisenhower did not. And it doesn't mean that every Democrat ended an epidemic. Jimmy Carter did not. But neither of those exceptions violates what I just said, that these epidemics occur only when Republicans get in, and it comes down from an epidemic only when Democrats do. Carter inherited an epidemic from his Republican predecessors and just handed it on to his Republican successors. He did, in the 4 years he was in office, he just didn't make any change of significance. Eisenhower was in office for 8 years. He inherited a low rate of violent death, and it was still low when he left office. Eisenhower, of course, was famous for having made it very clear that he supported the welfare state, he supported the New Deal. He insisted on this in a very explicit letter he wrote to one of his conservative brothers, and said that anybody who would do anything different from what he was doing, because his brother had complained, he was just like a Democrat, he said, the people who would do differently they are few and they are stupid. And so he really was kind of a Democrat in Republicans' clothing. But he's the one exception of Republicans causing an epidemic. But he's not an exception to the idea that epidemics occur only when Republicans are in power. Now, another way to look at the data is to not just look at the epidemics. By the way, I'm defining epidemics as significant increases above the median and the mean for the century as a whole. So I mean, it's not an arbitrary definition. I mean, it's quantitatively, you can document it. But you know, there are only about 6 examples that we can give of this, because these go on for years. There was an epidemic for 24 years, from Nixon through George H.W. Bush. That lasted a quarter of a century. So there aren't that many of these examples. So I looked at what are the year-to-year changes. And if you think of it, it's like, what would you say if you were following the profit and loss statement of a corporation from 1900 to the present? Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, the profits and losses. Or you're studying the Dow Jones average. It goes up, it goes down. And each year there'll be some arbitrary changes. With the Dow Jones, the long-range trend is sort of up. What I discovered, if I did a similar kind of study, what are the year-to-year changes under each party in the violent death rates, suicide, homicide, and the sum of the two, what we find is really quite amazing. The rate, I can show you what it looks like. During the 60 years the Republicans were in power, this is the red line, the rate just has tended to go up and up and up and up. In other words, it increases 2 or 3 times as often as it decreases, and the increases are larger than the decreases. The Democrats, which are in blue, these rates just go down year by year. The more years the Republicans are in power, the higher the rate gets. The more years the Democrats are in power, the lower it gets. What this shows is something that's important in medical research, which is a dose-response curve. In other words, the more, as I said, the more years one party's in, the more the effect it has. It's similar, like if you're studying cigarettes and lung cancer. The more cigarettes people smoke, the higher the rate of lung cancer. And the more years they've smoked, the higher the rate of lung cancer. And we can also study protective factors in preventive medicine. Regular exercise is a protective factor against heart attacks. So the more regularly people exercise, if they do it 3 times a week, you get a certain diminution. If they do it 7 times a week, you get even more, and so on, and the number of years. So what we have is data that the Republican Party can be considered a risk factor for violent death in the same way that cigarette smoking is a risk factor for lung cancer, and the Democrats are a protective factor against violent death in the same way that regular exercise is a protective factor against heart attacks. So I'm approaching violence as a problem in public health and preventive medicine. Not a moral and legal problem, but something that we can approach from that perspective.
This has been an excerpt from a presentation by James Giligan at Left Forum in June of 2013. Thank you for watching. Join us next time on Here and Now.
Thank you for watching Here and Now. I'm Beth Lamont. Please join us next time here on MNN or visit us online and on Facebook.